Just a very brief background of what we are going to be covering in this session. And of course, with the laudable goal of preserving the tax base of countries across the world by enforcing a global minimum corporate tax, the Pillar 2 solution is arguably amongst the most ambitious tax reforms the last century has ever seen. The sheer scale of this mammoth project brings along certain political, practical, as well as jurisprudential hurdles.
What are the challenges on the way forward if we believe that Pillar 2 will stay? I mean, the first one relates to the design features of Pillar 2, the refundable tax credit. What can you do on that front? What is acceptable? What is not? The fact that it's refundable makes it extremely difficult to take advantage of for a country to attract investment. Refundable means if your tax credit exceeds the tax due, you need to pay a check, meaning you put your fiscal balance at risk. Extremely difficult. You have the subsidies. You have some countries which are very rich, including some small open economies which are very rich, and they may be tempted to do subsidies a bit hidden or on criteria which are not so objective and which may make a link with the tax paid. It's contrary to the rule. The rule is extremely clear there, or very vague. It's clear and vague at the same time, which means that you have uncertainty, which is good if you want to police this. But let's see what happens on that front. The safe harbor may be considered as a risk as well if it's granted too easily or permanently, and Arim will address that, I'm sure. The second challenge is the complexity and the compliance cost. It's not because I moved to the private sector that I'm saying that. I think there is a global recognition that this is not easy. I would say, keeping my OECD hat, that we are in a transition period. At the end of the day, things will be more simple because you have one global information return, because you have integrated information system. But the transition cost is high. The level of guidance and the detail of the guidance is pretty big because all taxpayers come and want clarity on this or that.
And it was, interestingly enough, developing countries that were quite insistent on having a substance carve-out because they said, look, R&D incentives is a rich man's incentive. Like, nobody parks R&D in my small countries. It's about the factories. It's about the people. I need to be able to create incentives that are proportionate to the substance that you're putting in my country, which is why we created the substance carve. And that wasn't an easy conversation, but we ended up in this space. So if you have a routine return, and there's a question, we will certainly discuss this, like what is routine? On the carrying value of tangible assets, on payroll, then the pillar will not touch you. The pillar only comes in when you get to excess returns, and then it picks up 15%, but not on everything on the excess return. And if you look at the tangible assets, it also includes things such as spectrum or mineral rights. You're building a big infrastructure process. Your base is going to be pretty significant. So it affects you less. And so there's a certain logic here. It says the more you have incentives that attract substance and the more substance there is in the design, the less the Pillar 2 affects you. And there's a certain policy logic that countries agree that that is a sensible approach. And the proposition isn't to say that we shouldn't do incentives, but it's a value for money proposition also for governments that they do want and their people to participate in the revenue that is generated through the incentive. Much academic literature that indicates that investment allocation is more effective if it's done on a pre-tax basis than on an after-tax basis. So the factors that come more to the fore in this environment are factors such as education, infrastructure, a trained workforce, skilled labor, being closer to the market where you want to be. And so you see some of these effects. So when you do the impact assessment of Pillar 2, there is the amount that you collect through the application of the rules, right? And that may or may not be much, depending also how many countries do a QDMTT. But then significantly, whether you get it directly or indirectly doesn't really make the difference. It's the reduction in profit shifting. It's the investment that comes in the country where it's supposed to be coming on a non-tax basis, because that's where business would want to locate it, the customer.
Indeed, what is fascinating with the global minimum tax is that it's a new way of making international tax in the sense that you do have in substance global international tax rules. They are connected to one another. They apply over multiple jurisdictions, and yet it is not treaties but a set of domestic legislation. And I think this is a unique way of making international tax, which raises unique challenges. And of course, I think it was alluded before, this also raises question as to how to implement Pillar 2, and I think it's very interesting that we see that we have various models around. I mean, we have the way of transposing fully the globe model rules into the domestic implementing legislation, and then we have the approach that we in Switzerland have adopted, which is an incorporation by reference model, where we simply cross-reference to the globe model rules, not to the administrative guidance, but to the globe model rules. And what is also unique with the globe model rules, and probably inevitable given the fact that they were designed back in 2021 and much has emerged since then, is that we have this administrative guidance coming up. These guidance may clarify, they may also to some extent, I shouldn't say this, but perhaps supplement a bit the globe model rules. And it's interesting to see that some countries are even transposing the guidance itself in their implementing legislation, which shows that it has a value that is beyond clarification. So you have multiple issues. And then you have the broader framework, which is the relation of the globe minimum tax with other international obligations. I mean, I won't spend too much time on this, but I mean, you have the question of whether the globe rules are in compliance with tax treaty obligations, with investment treaty obligations. I think that the mere question that these issues arise shows that we probably in the future need to consider the implementation of these global initiatives in a more holistic fashion from the very beginning, and probably to have a more integrated.
So if you look at India as a jurisdiction, we always try to assess what is happening and actually have implications, so that whatever we do, it's a well thought through process. Because one hand we are thinking about simplification, and one thing on the other hand, which one of the panel members called one of the most complex pieces of legislation. So can we actually have them together? So that's the first question. But another deep question is, how do we implement it? What are the strategic choices in terms of legislation we have? So there's different things that countries have done. Like for some, they adopted the skeleton framework and left everything rest to regulations. Why did they do it? Because at that point, the globe rules were still work in progress. They're still work in progress. In one sense, it's not complete, because if you see the model rules and if you see the administrative guidance, at times they can go quite opposite way. And so it is at many places, and these are part of the political compromise, also part of the practical challenges of how we sort out issues and get it rolling ahead. So that's one way to do it. The second could be that you have a comprehensive legislation once and for all, like Germany did it. So that could be one model. Another model could be a reference model. So like New Zealand or Estonia did it. So they just have half a page, and they refer to everything to the model rules and the administrative guidances that they come. Can we do it? We are an OECD, we are not an OECD country, so obviously there are problems. So another thing is have the QDMTT. So again, it's something of a cost of a benefit thing. Should we put the whole thing or only a part of it, or do it in phases? So these are very important strategic decisions that are being taken. And there's another thing accompanied, that we already have a MAT. Why don't we tweak it? Why don't we make it quite similar, so that if you calculate the ETR, you would have nearly the same. So there'll be hardly any material differences. So these are the choices that are before the committee, and it is examining them. Another consideration is also the revenue, but I will say it is not the consideration. That's a very important thing, because a lot of people have done work on, it's in public domain, even Aditya has done some work on it, and it's also published.
The substance-based income exclusion, the logic is that we are giving a waiver for a low return. Well, a low return in a developed country and a developing country is quite different. I think what I've seen, I've done so many benchmarkings being someone from the field of transfer pricing. When I do benchmarking for looking at limited risk distributors or a limited risk manufacturer or a limited risk service provider, for the European nations, the number is around 4, 5, 7. When I do the same exercise for India, it's 12, 14. So how can you paint the whole world with the same brush? When the cost of borrowing in a country like Africa is 18%, how can you tell them that the SBI number for an African nation should be something around 10 and 8? For the capex which I'm going to put in that country, how can that be 8%? For a European nation where the cost of borrowing is something around 6, 8 or something around that, I can understand. So I think the law has been thought primarily from a European perspective, but the African nations and the Asian nations, that is an aspect. The numbers needs little bit of.
But guidance itself creates lots of complexity. And until now, if you think about it, even in, let's say, the big four firms, they still have this issue about interpretation of certain terminology, certain words, certain clarifications. They're still not absolutely clear. All right? Now, the countries in Southeast Asia fundamentally face difficulties largely because their capacity building, their knowledge ability, the resources and infrastructure is not there. You can talk to a Ministry of Finance official who does not even dare to come onto a Pillar 2 session in the Malaysian context because they really don't, they're not grasping it. So they're struggling. But Malaysia did one thing, and so did Singapore, which is introduce the QDMTT first. That's the safest option, right? Protect your base, and I think that's logical. But that added a few hundred pages to the legislation in Malaysia. So we have those particular issues as well. So the technical knowledge and the skills is actually poor. So in the end of the day, the Ministry of Finance, not only in Malaysia, but whether it's Indonesia, Thailand, relies on outside consultants and firms to have discussions and guidance and so on and so forth. So there is a catch-22 there in terms of how that is going to pan out. So to me, at the end of the day, I have no qualms about the principle behind Pillar 2. I'm one of those who believe that there should be a global minimum tax for everyone. So you prevent this competition. That fundamentally was the objective. But how to get there has been the challenge. And I do accept that we've got so much of guidance coming out, but in the end it's created more complexity as well. So I think the OECD perhaps needs to work perhaps with some of these countries step by step and see how they are willing to do that. I do not see Pillar 2 implementation to be evenly distributed across Asian countries. It's going to be, as pointed out earlier in our prep session, it's actually up to the countries if they want to do it, and so on and so forth. So the Asian countries, fundamentally in Southeast Asia, have decided that QDMTT is probably the easiest way to move on this.
Large multinational corporations have been consistently nudged over the last few years to proactively plan and be ready for Pillar 2 implementation. I mean, the main focus in the beginning was, getting a big picture assessment to identify whether they need qualify for transitional safe harbors, and soon everyone realized the magnitude of what they're dealing with. And organizations that quickly sort of adopt and activate a centralized model for planning for this, they sort of quickly jump to the conclusion or the need for a new Pillar 2 specific technology solution. Many call this an opportunity for a significant transformation, finance transformation opportunity in the organization, and like a cross-functional, which require cross-functional support, including tax, accounting, IT, internal audit, legal, basically everyone.